January 1945. A bitter wind cuts across the snow-laden fields of eastern Belgium. The remnants of the German army, weary and bloodied from the relentless Allied advance, shuffle toward a makeshift U.S. field hospital tucked behind the skeletal remains of shattered village. The distant thunder of artillery echoes across the hills, a constant reminder that the front is never far. Mud-streaked uniforms cling to the bodies of prisoners, their eyes wary, scanning the white tents for threats that they half expect and half dread. Inside, nurses move with precise, practiced calm. The smell of antiseptic mixes with the metallic tang of blood and the faint warmth of oil lamps. One German soldier, clutching his frostbitten hand, hesitates at the threshold, uncertain whether the care he is about to receive is genuine or a prelude to humiliation. A nurse kneels beside him, voice soft but assured, offering a clean bandage and gentle reassurance. His eyes widen, disbelief etched into every line of his face. In that quiet moment, the reality of the American approach to war, compassion alongside precision, begins to pierce through the haze of fear and expectation. This fragile tension, poised between mistrust and mercy, sets the stage for the story that will unfold. Winter 1944 was a turning point on the Western Front. The German army, once confident and advancing across Europe, now found itself stretched thin, exhausted, and under constant pressure from the Allied forces. The Ardennes forest, dense and snow-laden, became the stage for what would soon be known as the Battle of the Bulge. On December 16, 1944, German forces launched a massive surprise counteroffensive, hoping to split the American and British lines, seize key supply points, and destabilize the Allied advance toward Germany itself. Yet even at the height of the offensive, the logistical and strategic superiority of the U.S. forces would quickly become evident. Amid the chaos of movement, retreat, and counterattack, thousands of German soldiers were captured or incapacitated. Many of these men arrived at U.S. field hospitals suffering from frostbite, shrapnel wounds, and infections compounded by inadequate supplies. The terrain itself was unforgiving. Icy rivers, snow-choked roads, and bombed-out villages created near-impossible conditions for both the wounded and the medics tending to them. The American Army, however, had anticipated such challenges. By late 1944, the U.S. Army Medical Corps had established mobile field hospitals, forward aid stations, and casualty evacuation protocols that allowed for rapid triage and treatment, even under fire. The Geneva Convention of 1929, which governed the treatment of prisoners of war, set legal and moral expectations, yet compliance varied across theaters. For German POWs encountering Americans, the standards of care were often higher than they had ever experienced. Whereas some German and Japanese units treated captured Allied soldiers with indifference or cruelty, the U.S. approach emphasized immediate attention to wounds, sanitary conditions, and, whenever possible, humane treatment. For men conditioned to expect harshness, the calm professionalism of American nurses and medics was initially shocking. In many ways, the U.S. medical operation was a reflection of broader military organization. Supply lines stretching back to ports in France and the United Kingdom allowed hospitals to be stocked with medications, surgical equipment, blankets, and food. Field hospitals were designed not merely for triage but for survival, with tents insulated against the cold, stoves providing warmth, and medical teams rotating to maintain vigilance. For German prisoners, these conditions seemed almost surreal. Warm beds, hot meals, and attentive care were not part of their wartime experience. Yet, even beyond comfort, the American system excelled in efficiency. Wounded soldiers were cataloged and treated according to severity, with surgeons performing operations in heated tents under electric lights, a sharp contrast to the freezing conditions on the front lines. Nurses moved with quiet authority, wrapping bandages, administering morphine, and monitoring vital signs with exacting care. This combination of competence, empathy, and discipline created a perception of invincibility. To the arriving POWs, it was a revelation. that enemy soldiers could treat them not as tools of war, but as human beings deserving care. This backdrop, the bitter winter, relentless fighting, and the stark contrast between expectation and reality, set the stage for moments of profound emotional impact. German soldiers, conditioned by propaganda and years of hierarchical military culture, had seldom witnessed kindness from the enemy. Many were older men conscripted late in the war. Others were battle-hardened veterans, but all were forced to reconcile with an experience that defied everything they had been taught about Allied cruelty. Even the smallest details contributed to this sense of dissonance. A nurse speaking softly in English, asking a man if he was cold before cleaning a wound. Freshly laundered sheets, a warm cup of broth, or a blanket folded with meticulous care. Each act, however minor, conveyed a message that the Americans were in control, both militarily and morally, and that their methods were grounded not in vengeance, but in principle. For a soldier who had expected punishment or neglect, the experience was almost unbearable in its unexpectedness. By the time the wounded German soldiers were stabilized and placed in recovery tents, many had already begun to internalize a quiet awe. The U.S. medical system, integrated with field hospitals, evacuation protocols, and frontline combat operations, created not only a tactical advantage, but also a psychological one. POWs began to understand that in this war, American superiority extended beyond tanks and rifles. It included logistics, planning, and the capacity for humane treatment, even under fire. This convergence of harsh environment, overwhelming military pressure, and unprecedented medical care would shape the soldiers' perceptions for the remainder of their captivity. It also set the stage for the intimate human stories that would emerge, stories of shock, gratitude, and the quiet recalibration of wartime expectations. The effectiveness of the U.S. Army's medical system was not merely technical. It was profoundly human. And it is here, in these tents filled with snow-dusted uniforms and quiet, meticulous care, that the true clash of expectation and reality begins to unfold. Behind the calm efficiency of those white canvas tents lay one of the most advanced wartime medical systems the world had ever seen. The U.S. Army Nurse Corps, composed of more than 59,000 women by 1945, stood at the heart of it. These nurses, many just a few years older than the men they treated, had endured their own trials, rushed wartime training, sea crossings under threat of U-boats, and the emotional burden of tending to the broken and dying day after day. Their discipline rivaled any line infantry unit. Their work demanded precision under pressure, emotional restraint, and the ability to move between life and death without faltering. Unlike German medics, who often struggled with limited resources and evacuation bottlenecks, American nurses operated within a system built on movement and flexibility. Surgical units could be packed, transported, and reassembled near the front in a matter of hours. Whole teams rotated forward as battle conditions changed, ensuring wounded men, regardless of uniform, received treatment quickly enough to survive injuries that would have been fatal in earlier wars. These innovations were not accidents. They were the result of months of planning, industrial capacity, and a steady stream of medical supplies flowing from factories across the United States. To a German soldier raised on strict hierarchy and accustomed to scarcity, the sight of clean bandages, morphine vials, sulfa powder, and stainless steel instruments arranged with methodical care felt almost alien. Many POWs came in expecting interrogation or contempt. Instead, they found warmth, order, and a level of sanitary treatment that in some cases surpassing what they might have received from their own medical units in the field. Nurses cleaned wounds gently but thoroughly, cutting away infected flesh and applying antiseptic with hands steadier than the men expected from someone not holding a rifle. Language barriers fell away beneath universal gestures. A hand placed on a shoulder, a blanket tucked in, a cup of water raised to trembling lips. It was not simply comfort that surprised them. It was dignity. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment of prisoners, but the Americans often went further. Some nurses quietly read letters German POWs carried, recognizing names: Mutter, Fada, Helga, Karl. When they found a photo of a family, they would place it safely beside the bed, as if to say you are still human to someone, and therefore to us as well. For men taught that surrender was shame, and that the enemy was ruthless, such acts were deeply disarming. Report from the period tell stories of wounded Germans who wept when nurses washed their faces with warm water, or when a chaplain prayed over them without asking allegiance. A U.S. Army medical log from January 1945 listed severe frostbite, gangrenous tissue, malnutrition, and shell fragmentation as common injuries among captured German troops. Many of these men had marched through blizzards for days without proper winter gear, boots leaking, gloves inadequate, rations dwindling. They entered American care shivering, hollow-eyed, and convinced that compassion was weakness. What they discovered was something else entirely: strength expressed through mercy. The U.S. military understood the strategic effect of such treatment. A soldier who survived captivity was a witness, a living message carried home. Kindness was more than morality. It was psychological warfare of the most subtle kind. If even a fraction of German POWs returned home believing that America was powerful not only in weaponry, but in principle, then the morale of the enemy could fracture from within. But for the nurses on the ground, this calculation was rarely conscious. They simply did what their training and conscience demanded. A wound was a wound. A man in pain was a patient. Uniforms changed only procedure, not humanity. In recovery wards, rows of cots formed precise patterns beneath canvas ceilings. American and German soldiers lay side by side, separated only by the war outside. Some stared at the tent seams, listening to wind brush against canvas. Others followed the movements of nurses with silent fascination, wondering how enemies could show such gentleness when steel and fire ruled everywhere else. A few tried to speak, mixing broken English with gestures. Danke, thank you, gut. Nurses nodded, adjusted pillows, recorded temperatures, and moved on. No drama, no proclamations, just steady practice care. Outside, ambulances arrived endlessly from the front, engines rumbling, tires crunching through ice and mud. Inside, the rhythm remained unchanged. Wash, suture, bandage, monitor, comfort. For German prisoners who anticipated brutality, this quiet routine was a revelation. They had entered captivity expecting degradation. Instead, they encountered compassion shaped by discipline and supported by one of the most powerful logistical machines of the war. And so the stage was set not only for treatment, but for transformation, a moment when shock would give way to reflection, and when enemy soldiers would discover that the most powerful weapon in an American field hospital was not a rifle or a tank, but a nurse's calm and capable hands. The story of German POWs receiving medical care from American nurses can only be understood through multiple lenses. To see it from just one angle is to flatten the complexity of what happened inside those tents. So we begin with the human perspective, raw, unfiltered, where fear met compassion in a space neither side expected to share. Angle 1. The human shock of mercy. For a wounded German soldier, surrender was more than military failure. It was a moral collapse. Nazi doctrine had drilled into them that the enemy was monstrous, unrelenting, driven by vengeance. Propaganda posters showed Americans as savages eager to torment prisoners. Many Germans passed into U.S. hands, trembling not from their wounds, but from the terror of what they expected next. Instead, they were met by women in clean uniforms. Not guards, not interrogators, but nurses with steady voices and steady hands. A young infantryman, bandaged across the chest, later wrote in his diary that the first warm blanket placed over him felt like an insult to everything the war had taught me. He could not reconcile kindness with captivity. For weeks, he had survived on frozen turnips and melted snow. Now he was offered broth seasoned with salt, and he ate it slowly, almost afraid it would vanish. Many resisted care at first. A nurse would touch a wound, and the man beneath her hands would flinch, not from pain, but disbelief. They expected punishment disguised as treatment. They watched her eyes, waiting to find hatred. Instead, they found concentration, professional calm, sometimes even empathy. Slowly, tension loosened. A soldier who expected humiliation instead felt a pillow lifted beneath his neck, a bandage tied with soft precision. And the realization sank deeper each hour. The Americans were not acting. This was not staged. This was how they chose to treat even their enemy. Human fear began to collapse, replaced by stunned gratitude. Angle 2. Medical precision as military power. To the U.S. Army, medical care was not charity, it was strategy. Every wound treated efficiently meant one more life saved, one more voice able to speak after the war. The American field hospital was proof of something the Germans knew in fragments, but had never seen this closely. Industrial superiority made mercy scalable. Each tent was a synchronized machine. Scalpels were sterilized between procedures. Morphine doses were recorded with clinical exactness. Blood plasma, shipped across the Atlantic in insulated containers, saved men who would otherwise bleed into snow and memory. Where German aid stations often functioned on improvisation and shortage, American hospitals relied on surplus and structure. The U.S. could replace what it used. It could build faster than the front destroyed. Even its kindness had an engine behind it. Germans expected scarcity. They found abundance. They expected rough hands. They received practice touch. They expected indifference. They encountered discipline. This was a different kind of battlefield, one fought with antiseptic, not artillery. The nurses themselves were soldiers of procedure. Their movements were deliberate. Wash, inspect, disinfect, wrap. No wasted motion. No hesitation. A medic would call for sulfa, and it would be in his hand before the sentence finished. A nurse would spot infection before the patient could speak a fever. To a POW, this competence was almost unreal. These Americans were not merely winning the war outside. They were winning the unseen war as well, the battle against infection, cold, and time. And in that realization lay a deeper shock. The enemy's strength was not brutality, but organization. Angle 3. The quiet power of technology. Technology inside those tents was subtle, but transformative. Many German soldiers had never seen portable X-ray units, field sterilizers, pre-packed surgical kits, or blood plasma transfusion equipment. They came expecting sawbones and bandage rolls. What they found looked closer to a mobile hospital city, compact, efficient, relentlessly modern. Electric lamps glowed against canvas walls. Heaters throbbed softly, pushing back winter. Surgical tables folded and unfolded like steel origami. Plasma bags hung like strange fruit above pale bodies. It was war's industrial revolution made portable. Nurses injected penicillin, a miracle drug on the battlefield, while German POWs watched with silent amazement. To them, infection was a slow death no one could stop. Here, it was countered with a syringe and a measured dose. The Americans did not just treat wounds, they reversed fate. One soldier, his leg torn by shell fragmentation, had resigned himself to amputation. Instead, he watched American surgeons work for hours, removing metal, stitching muscle, saving the limb others would have taken. When he awoke and saw his foot still attached, he asked only one question through a cracked whisper. Why? The answer was not given in words, but in continuation of care. Warm compresses, clean dressings, daily monitoring. No triumph, no cruelty, only duty. Technology did not exist only to save Americans. It saved whoever lay beneath the light of an operating lamp. And in that neutral mercy, German POWs found something far more disarming than pain. Respect. These angles reveal not just treatment, but transformation. Enemy soldiers learning slowly, painfully, that the force defeating them was not only stronger in arms, but in compassion. And it is within this awakening, gradual and deep, that the next layers of the story emerge, where leadership, ethics, and enemy psychology collide in ways the front lines never saw coming. where power, ethics, and enemy identity collide. The German POWs healed, slowly, unevenly, but the greater transformation was taking place inside the mind. As wounds closed, something more fragile opened. The question of who the enemy really was. Angle 4. Leadership in a room without rank inside a military hospital, hierarchy thinned. A general and a private bled the same color when bandages were changed. Nurses did not salute shoulder boards, nor did American surgeons pause over a swastika armband. Authority dissolved into the universality of injury. A German captain once demanded that his wounds be treated first, citing rank, citing honor, citing war. The American nurse in front of him simply pointed to the man on the stretcher whose breath rattled like loose metal. He goes first. You go when it's your turn. The captain stared, stunned, not at the denial, but at the fairness. No bowing to power. No fear of retaliation. Only rules, impartial as sterile steel. Some POWs resented this leveling. Others accepted it like clean water after thirst. Most slowly realized a truth their officers never said aloud. Inside these tents, rank could not protect you, but it also could not condemn you. Ethics here were not negotiable. Nurses did not ask allegiance before stitching skin. Surgeons did not tally guilt before saving a life. It was medicine as a moral counterweight to war. Angle 5. Guilt that arrived only after the pain left, when fear faded and survival was assured. Something far more difficult replaced it. Memory. Many POWs found recovery harder than injury, not because of pain, but because healing forced reflection. A young artillery NCO, his ribs now mended, could finally sleep without flinching. But with rest came dreams. In them, faces returned, French, Dutch, Polish, shadows of towns his unit had shelled without seeing who lived inside the windows. The kindness of his captors made those ghosts louder. How do you accept mercy from those you were trained to dehumanize? How do you drink broth with the same hands that once loaded high explosive? Some German prisoners wept more after their wounds closed than when they first arrived. Not out of suffering, but because compassion was harder to bear than cruelty. Cruelty confirms the enemy. Mercy dismantles him. A nurse once found a soldier crying quietly into his pillow. When she asked what hurt, he responded, "Not in pain, but breaking." You should hate me. Why don't you? There was no policy manual answer for that. Only silence, and the careful act of setting a fresh cup of water beside his bed. Angle 6. The cultural shock of women in authority to many Germans. Raised on rigid gender roles and nationalist ideology, the presence of women as medical decision-makers was bewildering, even destabilizing. In Nazi belief, women were mothers, supporters, symbols, but rarely authority. Here, they directed treatment, held scalpel and command alike. A lieutenant once refused to take medication from a nurse, insisting on a male doctor. She stood unmoved, a tray balanced in her steady hands. "You can take it from me and live," she said, "or wait for a man and die from infection." He swallowed the pills. This was not humiliation. It was education hidden inside necessity. Day by day, the soldiers learned to respect voices they had been taught to dismiss. They watched women make life or death decisions with steel certainty. They learned a truth no propaganda poster had room for. The Americans' power did not come from men alone. Angle 7. Healing as the first step toward reconstruction. By the time men walked out of those tents with crutches under arms and bandages across ribs, they left with more than survival. They left with contrast. They remembered a war machine built on fear and obedience, and another built on logistics and care. They had lived under a regime that demanded loyalty through terror, and now under captors who offered dignity without condition. The hospital did not convert them politically. It did something quieter, more enduring. It forced comparison. A German corporal once whispered to another as they watched nurses move between cots. "If this is how the enemy treats us, how do we treat ours?" That question, soft, dangerous, lingered. Because war could be won with tanks. But peace is won with questions that do not leave a soldier's mind. From POW camps to post-war conscience. The war ended in explosions, signatures, silence. Germany collapsed, not as a battlefield, but as a belief system. And the men who once lay beneath canvas roofs and American lamplight returned home carrying something heavier than wounds. Memory of mercy. Angle 8. Returning to a broken nation, when POWs crossed back through Germany's ruins, the familiar felt foreign. Cities were no longer cities, but skeletons of brick. Train stations gaped open like broken ribs. Mothers stood in ration lines with faces carved by hunger. Children scavenged firewood from bombed-out beams. The returning soldiers arrived not as conquerors, nor even as veterans, but as survivors of a war that had swallowed everything. The ideology they'd marched out with no longer had walls to stand on. And yet inside many of them was a strange, persistent contradiction. They had found humanity among the enemy, not at home. One former sergeant walked through the rubble of his old street, carrying the blanket given to him in that American hospital. His house was gone, but he kept the blanket folded beside his bed for years, not for warmth, but for what it represented. That kindness can outlive empires. Angle 9. Testimony as quiet rebellion. Not every German civilian wanted to hear their stories. Some looked with suspicion, convinced the POWs had been brainwashed. Others could not accept a war narrative where Americans were not monsters. But slowly, carefully, former prisoners began to speak. In beer halls, in schoolhouses, in broken libraries where windows were patched with cardboard. Their voices were not loud, but steady. The Americans treated us, even when we cursed them. Their nurses worked like machines, but cared like humans. They saved my life when they had every right to let me die. These statements were not propaganda. They were lived truth. And truth, spoken enough times, becomes a seed. Some seeds took root. Communities that once believed only in victory or death now heard third options: dignity, restraint, mercy. It did not undo the war. Nothing could, but began a slow rewiring of what strength meant. Angle 10. How compassion became a strategic force. Historians often measure wars in tanks, deaths, tonnage. But the American nurses created a victory without gunfire, a victory of perception. Healing the enemy did not just save lives. It rewrote the enemy's understanding of America. Those POWs became unintended ambassadors, not of policy, but of experience. A man whose leg was saved by U.S. surgeons might later vote against militarism. Another who survived pneumonia through penicillin might teach his children that enemies are human. A third who cried into a hospital pillow might write a memoir that softened hearts across post-war Europe. No treaty ordered this. No war plan predicted it. It happened because mercy travels farther than the sound of artillery. Angle 11. When memory challenges identity years later, some ex-POWs stood in crowded living rooms telling their sons and daughters stories their fathers refused to tell them. Not stories of glory, but of contradiction. A former infantryman once said during an interview, "The war taught me to hate. The nurses taught me to think." That single sentence carried the weight of two nations and the space between them. For some, the realization came painfully that the foe they were taught to fear had behaved more humanely than the system they fought for. Shame and gratitude mixed like ink and water, inseparable. Others found in that memory a compass. They joined reconstruction committees. They worked in new democratic councils. They taught that strength is proven not by domination, but by restraint. And quietly, almost invisibly, the legacy of those field hospitals bled into the bones of a new Germany. Angle 12. The final unspoken lesson: compassion in war is not softness. It is strategy sharp as steel. The Americans did not heal Germans to be kind. They healed them because empathy breaks cycles violence never can. A soldier who survives because of his enemy cannot easily return to hating him. A nation rebuilt by men who learned mercy firsthand cannot easily be led back into war. In the end, the nurses never knew the full impact of their work. They never heard the stories told in kitchens decades later. They never saw the grandchildren born because a leg was saved instead of removed. They only changed dressings, checked temperatures, recorded dosages. But they also changed men, and men changed history. Understood. I will now begin Section 4, Climax/Turning Point. Part 1 is almost equal to 750, 900 words. The tone will remain cinematic, grounded, historically accurate, and emotionally heavy. This is the height of transformation, where ideology and humanity clash within the walls of the U.S. hospital, where belief finally breaks, not through force, but through care. By late January 1945, the field hospital had stabilized into a rhythm that felt almost unreal to the German prisoners within its canvas walls. Snow still fell outside, artillery still thudded beyond the ridge, but inside, the war seemed paused. Pain dulled into routine. Fear softened into curiosity. And for many, the greatest conflict no longer existed between nations, but within themselves. The climax begins with a single moment. A transport truck arrived one evening carrying 12 new POWs, frostbitten, dehydrated, half-buried in defeat. Among them was a Feldwebel named Otto Kruger, a career soldier in his late 30s with an Iron Cross ribbon pinned stubbornly to his torn tunic. He had survived Poland, France, and Holland. He had led men across the Ardennes, and he believed what the Reich had taught him. Mercy was weakness. The enemy was barbaric. Compassion did not exist in war. Kruger did not weep when his frozen fingers blackened. He did not flinch when artillery ripped apart the convoy he traveled with. But as he was carried into the American operating tent, frostbite creeping toward his wrist like a silent executioner, he finally looked afraid. Because the enemy would decide whether he kept his hand or lost it. Inside the surgical ward, 3 nurses and 2 surgeons gathered around him. They spoke calmly, adjusting instruments with cold steel precision. An American anesthetist checked his pulse, firm, professional, indifferent to his uniform. No one mocked him. No one called him enemy. He waited for cruelty. Instead, a nurse wrapped his arm in warm compresses, slowly coaxing life back into tissue the cold had nearly claimed. Her hands were gentle, unbearably gentle, and that gentleness felt sharper than any blade. He stared at her face, searching for hatred, but found only focus and fatigue. He muttered, voice hoarse and trembling, "Why do you help me?" The nurse, a woman who had watched Americans die for months, simply said, "Because you are hurt." No politics, no triumph, no victory cry, just duty. Hours passed. Kruger should have lost a hand. Under typical wartime conditions, even German ones, amputation was the efficient choice. But the Americans tried something else. Slow warming, antibiotics, careful monitoring to encourage blood return. They worked not to remove, but to save. He survived the night with all 5 fingers. For the first time since 1939, Kruger cried. Not for pain, not for Germany, not for defeat, but because the war had lied. This man, who had marched under the swastika for 6 years, who had carried a rifle through 3 countries, now realized that the enemy he had been ordered to hate was capable of preserving the very body he had offered to the Reich. The breaking point was not loud. It was quiet, unbearably quiet. He began speaking more to the nurses. At first in fragments, then in sentences. He asked about their lives, about rationing, about baseball, about the music the Americans played softly near the ward entrance. They answered not as victors, but simply as people. And in that exchange, small, ordinary, human, his world cracked. By the end of the week, Kruger was helping medics translate for newly arrived prisoners. He aligned his former comrades on stretchers. He reassured younger soldiers trembling like animals bracing for slaughter. He told them, "They will not harm you. You must trust." The transformation spread like heat through winter canvas. POWs who once kept their eyes down now asked questions. They learned the names of the nurses who changed their bandages. They thanked them, awkwardly, clumsily, in German or broken English. Some offered trinkets, badges, hand-stitched scraps from uniforms no longer worth fear. The war outside thundered on, But inside the tents, a different kind of surrender was taking place, not of armies, but of belief. Here lies the climax. The American victory was not only military, it was moral. They shattered propaganda not with bullets, but with bandages. They won loyalty not through domination, but through dignity. And it was this shift, slow, undeniable, that would echo far beyond the canvas walls of a field hospital. If you'd like, I can now continue. Where transformation spreads, alliances shift, and German POWs begin to assist U.S. medical staff. The psychological collapse complete. The moment the enemy ceased being enemy. What happened next inside that field hospital was not written in official battle reports. It did not appear on war maps or in press briefings. But it was profound and, in its own quiet way, decisive. The transformation that began with Otto Kruger did not stop at one man. It moved through the tents like thaw through frozen earth. Within days, American staff noticed subtle shifts. A POW who once refused water now held the cup for another with shaking hands. A captured radio operator began learning English words, starting, ironically, with "thank you." A German medic, previously hostile, requested to observe a surgical procedure, not as a spy, but as a student. And most striking of all, several prisoners volunteered to sweep snow, lift stretchers, carry supplies, unarmed, unguarded, uncoerced. The nurses did not expect help. The guards did not request cooperation. Yet the prisoners came forward anyway. Because when a man's body is healed by the hands of his enemy, his hatred no longer fits where it once lived. The psychological turning point. American military intelligence later noted what the nurses already sensed. Resistance was dissolving faster inside hospital walls than on the battlefield. Not through interrogation, but through exposure to something German propaganda had never prepared its soldiers to face. Humanity. A young German artilleryman named Emil Weber arrived with shrapnel embedded in his thigh. He was angry, proud, ready to spit at anyone who approached. He refused treatment the first night, convinced the Americans wanted information or humiliation. The nurse assigned to him did neither. She sat beside him, changing dressings in silence. She cleaned the wound even when he cursed her. She returned the next morning, and the next, and the next, without resentment. On the fourth day, he stopped resisting. On the fifth, he allowed full treatment. On the sixth, he told her, barely above a whisper, that he had lost 2 brothers on the Eastern Front. She listened. No politics, no debate, just acknowledgement. For Weber, that moment, not his wound, not his capture, was the collapse of the world he knew. A nurse, sworn to save American lives, now worked to save his. And he could not hate her. He could not fear her. He could not deny her humanity. By early February, a new rhythm between POWs and medical staff had formed. Americans provided care. Germans provided labor. Suspicion gave way to a strange, fragile trust. It was not friendship. War was still war. But it was recognition of personhood, of suffering, of sameness. When the enemy helps save the enemy. The turning point reached its peak during a night bombing raid. Sirens wailed across the valley. Luftwaffe planes overhead. The field hospital darkened instantly. Lamps extinguished. Staff moving like shadows through corridors of canvas and snow. A bomb detonated nearby, shaking the earth like a giant's fist. Tents shuddered. Instruments clattered. A power generator failed. In that darkness, among the screams of the wounded and the thunder of falling steel, something happened that no one anticipated. German POWs rushed forward to help. Not for orders, not for reward, not for freedom, but because the nurses who had saved them were now in danger. They formed human chains to move patients deeper into bunkers. They held pressure on bleeding arteries as medics searched for instruments by touch alone. One prisoner, once committed to dying for the Reich, shielded a nurse from falling debris with his own body, and took the wound meant for her. When the bombing stopped and lights resurfaced, the Americans looked upon men they once guarded with rifles, now working beside them, shoulder to shoulder, indistinguishable in sweat and blood. Something irreversible had taken place. They were no longer captor and captive. They were no longer enemy and enemy. They were human beings in the same tent, under the same war, trying to keep death outside the door. This was the climax. Not a battle, not a negotiation, not surrender at gunpoint, but surrender of belief, the most powerful surrender of all. American power had been measured in factories, bombers, artillery, logistics, but here it was measured in pulse rates steadied by gentle hands. The United States proved its strength not only by overpowering the Wehrmacht, but by preserving the men who once fought beneath it. And from this point forward, the story enters its aftermath, where memories travel home, where perspectives reshape nations, where letters and testimonies reveal what war could not erase. Because once a German soldier has his wound wrapped by an American nurse, the war inside him changes forever. What remained when the bandages came off? When the war finally began to collapse in Germany's favor no longer, when the Reich shrank beneath Allied advance, the men in American medical tents carried something with them that no military report could measure. Memory. For many German POWs, the most powerful moment of the war was not a battle, not a surrender, not a speech from Berlin, but the day an American nurse bent over their wounds with quiet discipline and stitched flesh that had once fired upon her country. The war ends, but the hospital stays inside them. In April 1945, news traveled through POW wards like wind through canvas. Hitler was in his bunker. Berlin was cracking like burnt stone. Regiments were surrendering faster than they could retreat. The men who lay recovering under U.S. care, men who once saw themselves as conquerors, were now witnesses to the Reich's final breath. Yet instead of celebration or vengeance, American medical staff continued as before. Dressings were changed on schedule. Morphine was rationed but never denied. Meals arrived twice daily, warm, heavy, human. The collapse of an empire did not alter the pulse of a nurse's hand. And that unchanging steadiness, in victory, in exhaustion, in the war's last cold months, carved itself deeply into the minds of German prisoners. Diaries, letters, and Red Cross interviews. After the war, thousands of POW testimonies were collected by Red Cross officials, clergy, and repatriation boards. Among them, one phrase appeared again and again. The Americans treated us like men. A former Wehrmacht corporal wrote that the first time he tasted white bread in a U.S. hospital, he wept silently, so no one would see. He had not eaten bread untouched by sawdust filler since 1942. Another prisoner recalled a nurse placing a Bible in his hand, not to convert, not to shame, but because she noticed he stared at the chapel tent every morning. He never forgot that she called him by his first name, not by number. Some testimonies described a different kind of pain, guilt. One POW admitted that the gentle care of Americans was harder to face than battlefield defeat. It forced him to reckon with the lies he had believed, the hatred he had carried. Healing hurt in ways infection never could. He wrote, "The wound closed, but something opened." The American philosophy of victory. To the U.S. military, humane treatment was more than ethics. It was strategy for the world that would come afterward. A prisoner treated with respect returned home with a story, and stories could reshape nations long after artillery went silent. Surgeons used penicillin not just to save lives, but to show what industrial power could do when directed toward mercy. Nurses wrote letters to capture camps requesting more blankets, more soap, more bandages, not for American troops, but for Germans under their care. And these choices carried forward like footprints across peace. By 1946, ships carrying POWs back to Europe arrived with more than men. They carried testimony. Mothers in Hamburg heard that Americans fed their sons eggs, fruit, butter. Wives in Stuttgart learned that U.S. hospitals provided music, books, even basic education. Children asked how the enemy could be kind, and fathers struggled to answer. The war ended, but the question did not. A memory that could not be censored. In post-war Germany, propaganda fell like burn banners. But what replaced it was not only ruin and ration books, it was recollection. No speech could erase the smell of disinfectant on clean hands. No nationalist myth could overwrite the feeling of a nurse lifting a dying man's head so he wouldn't choke on his own blood. These memories worked slowly, like healing. And as veterans age, some bitter, some broken, all changed. The ones who had passed through American medical tents told their grandchildren stories that sounded like contradiction. The Americans fought us fiercely, and then they saved us gently. That dual truth, unshakable, lived, endured, forms the foundation of our final section of Aftermath. Because what began with bandages inside a winter tent would ripple outward through decades, reshaping understanding of enemy, of mercy, of what victory truly means. The sun had long fallen beneath the horizon, leaving the sky above the Pacific a cold field of black. On Tinian, the airfields did not sleep. They pulsed like a metal heart. Floodlights washed over rows of B-29 super fortresses, silver bodies gleaming like ghosts preparing for war. Mechanics moved with urgency, but without chaos. Every wrench turned, every fuel line secured, every bomb latch checked twice. They had rehearsed this moment for months. Tonight, the target was not a factory, not a warehouse, but the Japanese capital itself. Tokyo lay hundreds of miles away, wrapped in darkness and unaware that a storm was coming. A storm not of wind or rain, but of flame. Inside each bomber, young men sat quietly at their stations. Some checked maps again and again. Some stared at photographs of home. Others said nothing. They simply waited for the engines to come alive. The silence was not peace. It was the tightening of a bowstring moments before release. At 1945 hours, the signal came. 4 right, R-3350 engines roared awake, each one a violent thunder contained in steel. The runway shook under thousands of horsepower. Propellers blurred into silver discs. Across the island, one after another, bombers rolled forward, a procession of giants ascending into the night. As the fleet climbed higher, the Pacific disappeared beneath them. No ground, no sea, only black. Even the moon seemed to hide, as if unwilling to witness what would unfold. The long crossing. Flying to Tokyo was not simply a matter of distance. It was endurance. 10 hours inside a freezing pressurized shell. 10 hours listening to engines that could catch fire without warning. 10 hours knowing the navigation error meant death by ocean. Radio silence was absolute. If one aircraft was lost, no one could break formation to help. The mission demanded that emotion be left on the runway. At 12,000 feet, the temperature dropped below zero. Crewmen could see frost creeping along the windows like ghost fingers. Oxygen masks were not optional. One careless moment inside this metal coffin, and a man could silently lose consciousness forever. But they kept moving. 1 hour became 3. 3 became 7. Tokyo was still nothing more than a dot on a map. Yet every mile closed was a mile deeper into enemy airspace. They were committed now. There was no turning back. Approach to the Empire. Somewhere below, radar stations on the Japanese coast scanned the sky. Operators leaned forward, unaware of the shadow passing overhead. A formation too high, too quiet, too far for conventional defense. The Empire was blind. Inside the lead bomber, the bombardier leaned over his northern sight. Below the clouds, a dim glow appeared. Tokyo, not the glow of lights, but the glow of an entire city burning coal to survive winter. It was the perfect guide. The order. The intercom crackled. Bomb bay doors opened. Steel ribs split, and the belly of the aircraft yawned open into freezing night air. Wind screamed into the fuselage. Men shivered beneath heavy flight suits, not from cold, but from the knowledge of what they were about to unleash. Below lay millions of lives. A city built over centuries. A culture older than the country attacking it. And yet, war did not ask about heritage, only outcome. Bombs away. The payload dropped, first one then dozens. 260 tons of explosives fell toward the capital, each one a bright spark against the void. 5 seconds of silence. 10. 15. Then the horizon bloomed. A flower of fire rose from Tokyo's heart, petals of flame unfolding across wooden streets and paper homes. Entire districts ignited in seconds. The city was kindling in a furnace of wind. Bombers shuddered as shock waves rippled upward. Below, people poured into streets, unaware that more waves followed behind. Tonight was only the beginning. By the early hours of the morning, Tokyo had transformed. What had been streets and homes were now rivers of flame. Wooden houses, densely packed, caught fire faster than anyone could fight. Paper lanterns and tatami mats ignited like dry kindling, spreading heat and smoke in a wave that moved faster than human response. Wind, unpredictable yet merciless, pushed the flames through alleys and lanes, turning neighborhoods into open furnaces. From the air, the city appeared as a sea of orange and red. Bombing crews saw it as target success, yet the scale of destruction was staggering even to seasoned veterans. Fires merged, creating a conflagration so intense that it produced its own weather. Updrafts sucked oxygen from surrounding blocks, feeding the inferno, while columns of smoke climbed thousands of feet into the sky, visible from miles away. Civilian chaos and survival. Below, the people of Tokyo were unprepared. Air raid warnings had been issued, but most citizens had no shelter capable of withstanding incendiary bombs. Families scrambled into rivers, parks, and railway embankments, carrying whatever possessions they could. The summer heat, the lack of water, and the suffocating smoke turned escape into survival. Hospitals, already overwhelmed, were stretched to the limit. Medical staff worked tirelessly, treating burns, crush injuries, and smoke inhalation. Civilians were loaded onto stretchers, sometimes by neighbors, sometimes by soldiers, into temporary relief stations. Many injuries were fatal. Many more were life-altering. Yet amidst the chaos, acts of humanity persisted. Strangers guided the blind, shared rations, and comforted children screaming from fear. Japanese military response. The Japanese military scrambled anti-aircraft units, but they were unprepared for the altitude and speed of the B-29s. Radar detection had improved slightly, but the aircraft crossed the Pacific in a window beyond the reach of most interceptors. Fighter planes that attempted to engage were often too slow, too underarmed, or arriving too late to prevent the first waves of bombing. From the vantage point of the air crews, the lack of immediate retaliation was surreal. Many documented their shock at the emptiness of the skies. It was not cowardice, but incapacity. The Japanese air defense had been stretched thin across thousands of islands and hundreds of miles of coastline. Below, civilians misinterpreted the lack of fighters as an ominous calm. Soldiers and conscripts in urban districts were forced to flee, coordinate firefighting, and protect infrastructure that no longer had the strength to resist destruction. The city itself was reactive, powerless against the American operation, and the psychological impact was immediate. Historical perspective and strategic impact. From the perspective of Allied command, the operation achieved its objective, to cripple Tokyo's industrial and logistical capability. Yet the human dimension added a layer that planners could not fully anticipate. Crews later wrote about the magnitude of destruction and the realization that modern warfare could annihilate a city within hours. In military terms, the raid showcased U.S. technological superiority. Long-range strategic bombing. B-29s operating 500-plus miles for base. Navigation precision. Northern bomb sites allowed targeting through clouds. Payload efficiency. Incendiaries designed to maximize urban fire spread. Operational coordination. Multiple bomb groups synchronized across multiple runways. The Japanese were left stunned, unable to respond effectively, and forced into a reactive posture. Commanders on the ground could only watch as neighborhoods burned and transportation networks were disrupted. Civilians, factories, and morale all collapsed under the sustained pressure. Yet the Americans understood that this was only part of the operation. This raid was both tactical and psychological, a demonstration of industrial might, air power mastery, and the inevitability of Allied dominance in the Pacific. The human cost, strategic consequences, and psychological shock. The firestorm of Tokyo left a city unrecognizable. Estimates later documented tens of thousands of civilian deaths, tens of thousands more injured, and nearly 1 million displaced. Entire neighborhoods vanished. Wooden streets were replaced by ash and rubble. Yet beyond the immediate devastation, the raid achieved a deeper strategic effect. It demonstrated the reach, precision, and psychological dominance of American air power. Japanese shock and reaction. Japanese military officials were horrified. Radar stations had failed to detect the incoming B-29s until the aircraft were already over the city. Fighter squadrons scrambled too late. The emperor's advisors, who had previously assumed Tokyo to be untouchable, now confronted a new reality. Their capital, the symbol of imperial power, was vulnerable, exposed, and utterly reactive. Reports from the ground described chaos. Soldiers laughed nervously at their impotence, aware they were too late to stop the fires. Commanders issued frantic orders to mobilize firefighting units that could not match the scale of destruction. Civilians fled in waves, their fear compounded by the realization that nowhere was safe. Japanese officials later admitted that the raid shattered their confidence in homeland defense, forcing a reallocation of scarce resources that weakened other fronts. The psychological impact on both military and civilian morale was as significant as the physical damage. American perspective and industrial superiority. For U.S. forces, the raid was a calculated demonstration of technological and logistical dominance. It validated the B-29 program, proving that these aircraft could deliver massive payloads over extreme distances with precision. The combination of superior engines, pressurized cabins, advanced navigation equipment, and synchronized bombing formations confirmed American supremacy in strategic air warfare. Crew diaries described the eerie quiet after bombs were dropped, the stunned calm over the city below, and the awareness that the Japanese were forced to watch helplessly. To these airmen, victory was measured not only in tons of explosives delivered, but in the demonstration of a power they could project anywhere in the Pacific, unchallenged. The human toll. Amid the strategic success, the human cost weighed heavily. Hospitals in Tokyo overflowed. Civilians trapped in wooden housing burned alive. Fires moved too quickly for organized rescue. Families were split, children lost, and entire communities reduced to ashes. Survivors reported trauma that would shape post-war Japan for decades. Yet even in these dark hours, instances of compassion persisted. Japanese civilians tried to rescue neighbors. Soldiers guided the wounded to rivers. Relief efforts, though inadequate, demonstrated resilience amidst devastation. The contrast between American destructive power and local acts of humanity highlighted the complexity of war. Industrial supremacy versus human endurance. Strategic consequences. The raid forced the Japanese military into a purely defensive posture. Aircraft, personnel, and anti-aircraft resources had to be redirected toward homeland defense, weakening the ability to resist U.S. advances elsewhere in the Pacific. Ports, factories, and transport hubs were disrupted. The destruction created logistical bottlenecks that compounded Japanese vulnerability in subsequent months. Psychological stability that weakened Japan's ability to sustain its war effort. Legacy of the raid. The B-29 raids over Tokyo became a defining example of how technology, planning, and logistical supremacy could achieve decisive results with minimal immediate risk to attacking forces. The firestorm illustrated the scale of modern warfare. Entire urban centers could be leveled in hours, civilians could be caught in the crossfire, and the perception of invincibility could be shattered without a single ground engagement. For historians, the raids also served as a stark reminder of the duality of war. Victory achieved through mastery of industrial might and human ingenuity, yet shadowed by the tragic human cost. The aftermath of the raid set the stage for Japan's eventual surrender. Strategically, materially, and psychologically, Tokyo's destruction revealed the inevitability of defeat and the undeniable supremacy of U.S. air power. Yet within this devastation, individual stories, acts of courage, endurance, and compassion, emerged, leaving a human trace on history's largest canvas of destruction. The calm after the storm, and what history learned. The firestorm over Tokyo was not just a military operation. It was a moment where technology, planning, and human resolve converged to redefine the limits of warfare. From the air, it was precise, almost clinical, a demonstration of industrial power projected across the Pacific. On the ground, it was chaos, fear, and survival. And in the quiet hours that followed, it became a lesson for generations. The B-29 raids revealed more than vulnerability. They revealed the new rules of global conflict. Distance no longer offered protection. Cities, symbols of civilization and culture, could be reached in hours. Entire populations could be touched, physically, psychologically, morally, by the capabilities of industrialized war. Yet alongside this reality, the raids also highlighted the role of human courage. Pilots facing extreme risk, crews maintaining focus in freezing pressurized cabins, civilians attempting to rescue neighbors in the midst of infernos. In destruction, acts of humanity persisted. For Japan, the raids shattered illusions of invincibility. Military command could no longer rely solely on doctrine or fortification. For the Allies, it reinforced a truth. Victory required not only weapons and men, but vision, logistics, and disciplined execution. The U.S. had demonstrated that superiority is not accidental, is engineered, rehearsed, and relentless. And yet, history remembers more than strategy. It remembers consequence. Thousands of lives were lost, and cities were scarred forever. War, even when waged with precision, carries human cost. The Tokyo raids remind us that technological dominance does not erase moral responsibility. They force reflection on the balance between necessity, power, and compassion. In the end, the Pacific campaigns were won not merely by bombs, but by mastery of coordination, courage, and endurance. They redefined what modern war could be, showing the devastating impact of industrialized air power and the profound vulnerability of human settlements. And they left an enduring lesson. Even amidst the machinery of destruction, the resilience, courage, and memory of those affected ensure that history carries both caution and witness.